everybody, and welcome to Skeptic Hangout, the place where we sit back, relax, and discuss some of humanity's most controversial and intriguing concepts through the lens of skepticism. We have with us Richard, who is excitable, pedantic, and colorful. Wave for the camera, Richard. And Laura, the energetic, passionate chatterbox. And Richard, who is enthusiastic and witty, yet, by his own definition, gormless. Today,
I've already stubbed my elbow on something on the desk just as we've started, so it's already happening.
fantastic. I'm glad we're off to a good start. And today we will be discussing God. So grab your English tea or your triple shot caramel mocha with almond milk, get comfy, and join us as we unpack just who exactly this God guy is anyway. So let's get started. How are you guys doing today?
Good.
I'm
Obviously,
good.
it's night time here in the UK, and obviously you've got plenty of daylight where you are. So it's normally winding down time about now, but otherwise very good. Yeah.
Yeah, so I should say good evening every time we chat, huh? Okay, so today we're going to be talking about God, and that is a pretty dang broad subject. So, which one of you wants to get started?
I think as the only former non-theist,
What do they call him? Cradle atheist?
cradle atheist. Yeah, that's a new term I've
Yeah, I
learned
like that
recently.
term.
I think it's a broad subject, especially from someone who's from like me, who's not been in a particular religion where there is a God to have a definition of. Because for me, it's not just a creator God. It's that God entails, Thor and the different Hindu gods and different aspects of gods rather than just a prime mover creator God. So I think any conversation about God with believers needs to come from a place of defining what or who they're talking about to begin with.
Because I guess for you, Richard, I guess you've never had your own personal definition of that for you in your own life, and you're only ever accessing the idea of God in relation to other people and their ideas about God. Whereas I guess me and Laura have both had ourselves in the past our own personal definitions of God. So I guess in some ways that might make conversations that you have easier because you're automatically needing to know someone else's definition. Whereas for me and Laura, potentially we might have the tendency to input our own biases and ideas in there that might get in the way of understanding other people as much as we could do potentially.
Yeah, I think that's
Sure.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, I have a concept of God. I grew up in England with the Church of England as a predominant religion. And even from like 5, 6, 7, there was kind of the knowledge of the concept of the Christian God, but without any kind of personal attachment to it.
Yeah, so I was gonna say one thing that I've noticed with growing up, not growing up, but having that preconceived notion of God is that anytime you hear someone refer to God um or the concept of a God, like what Richard said, like you already automatically have these biases that so they might say something like philosophically you might talk about a deity, like a creator deity. Well, in my mind, and perhaps in Richard's mind, we're already assigning that deity certain characteristics like all loving, all knowing, a personal God, a loving God, something like that. And so
So I
he,
remember learning about, like Greek gods at school and things and thinking, how
yeah.
can they have believed in gods that were flawed and had these character traits and that were mean and selfish and other things? Because in my head, God was this all loving, all knowing, all, omnibenevolent being. And I guess it was that difference sort of between God with a capital G and a God with a lowercase g. And obviously now we're all in different places from where we were in the past, and in lots of ways have, I guess, more knowledge about sort of those other ideas and what have you. I don't think I had a point. I think I just started talking, hoping a point would occur, but it never really did. So I'll stop talking now.
No, I think you actually brought up a really good point because we're talking about this broad concept of a God, and we kind of fail to realize that there's a lot of different concepts, like multiple gods. And so when we're going to talk about God as a broad concept, I think we should try and get away from the specific Christian definition of what a God is and kind of start expanding on what are the different types of God beliefs? Like,
Yeah, because before we started recording, I was cheating. I did some Googling. And I
no.
tried, I tried to find if there was any sort of consensus on, like, how many gods do people believe in the world now, at the moment. And there's just no way of knowing. I mean, I know we can talk about even amongst people of the same religion, as many people as belong to that religion, there might be that many versions of that God. And I think potentially that's maybe overstating it a bit. But yeah, I think it's impossible to know as well what things, even like in the history of humanity, had be considered gods. If people worshipped the sun in the Stone Age, were they worshipping the sun as a god, thinking that the sun had, you know, actions that it undertook, or whether it was just this thing that they worshipped because it gave them sunlight and warmth and all that. I think it's really impossible to categorize all of it, really. But like you say, try and move away from, when we're thinking about God, from that Christian monotheistic sort of prejudice that we might have from our sort of Western point of view.
I think you
Yeah,
brought up.
certainly.
Oh,
And
go ahead.
I think I think again we need to bring it to a conversational point of thing rather than speaking broadly about God or gods. If we're speaking to a particular person, we need to understand their definition. And because as Richard said, if you're talking about Christianity, for example, how many different variations or versions or beliefs about just the Christian God? I mean, if you want to take it really broadly, and you don't want to commit the not a true Scotsman fallacy, you've got the
You have to
Jehovah's
ask
Witnesses, you've
questions.
got the Mormons,
Yeah.
you've got Church of England. These are all wildly different variants on the Christian God concept.
I
And
mean,
you
since
can't
leaving Christianity myself, I've had conversations with other Christians where I've talked about sort of problems I've had with ideas and whatever, and they've said, I don't think I believe in the God that you don't believe in either. Like,
I've heard
we
that a
agree that
lot,
we don't believe in
actually.
that God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you're right. I think that when we're talking to others about God, the important thing is to ask clarifying questions and to ask them to define their God. And so if we're going to converse with them about it or argue with them about it, or disagree, we have to know what it is that we're disagreeing on. And so I think you bring up
Yeah.
a really super good point. I do tend to believe that there are as many gods as there, like, definitions of a god or concepts of a god, as there are people who believe in a god. Actually, as there are people in the world, because even as atheists,
Yeah.
we have concepts of what a god is
Yeah.
or what a god might be. And I think even then, they're all different.
So, Laura, as a former Christian and a former Muslim,
Yes.
traveling between the two, did you find that did you have the same concept of God as just the Abrahamic God, or did you have different concepts of the Abrahamic God moving between the religions?
Because lots of people talk, don't they, about like the God of Christianity, Judaism, Islam being the same God, just represented to different people in different times in different ways, and other people consider them completely separate. And yeah, I just sort of butted in before you answered your question there, Richard.
Ooh, so
Richard.
there's two different ways that I want to discuss that. So first is the first Richard's question, which was how did I perceive it? But second, and the one that I want to answer first really quickly is the way that other people perceive it when they say different gods. So typically when people are saying that, I think they're seeing God as more of like a God character in a book, like God as an actor or a character. So when you start looking at those characters, they are wildly different characters. The closest two that come together is Judaism and Islam. They have the closest concepts between the three of what this God character is. And even then, it's wildly different. But then you have the Christian version of that same Abrahamic God. And that character is completely different from the other two religions, especially when you bring in the Trinity and stuff like that, which I know not all Christians do. But so that kind of answers that question in terms of when they say, "Oh, your God, that's not my God," and two different, they're almost talking about these characters or these concepts. But if you're going to talk about, I believe an actual God exists, I don't think Christians, Jews, or Muslims think that there's three separate gods and they're vying for power or one is above the other. Or I think that they know that there's, from their truth perspective, that there's only one God out there and that we're seeing him in three different ways. I don't know if that makes sense the way that I answered it, but
Yeah, it did.
yeah. So getting back to first Richard's question about me. So yeah, I definitely had two separate concepts of a God moving from Christianity into Islam. It was the same, like I said, God character. It was more my understanding of the character. But even as a Christian, I remember my brother asking me once, like, what I thought about the crucifixion and like the purpose of the sacrifice. And I had this wildly different interpretation that I don't think I've ever heard any other Christian offer because I didn't believe in the Trinity and I didn't believe that Jesus was God. And that was one of my struggles with Christianity that made it so easy for me to transfer into Islam. So for me, it was, well, people put on the perspective, or people put on God the whole need for sacrifice, right? And God was saying, "No, this is the only sacrifice I need. I don't need any sacrifices. Like that will not save your sins. So this is the last sacrifice." And he was like removing that need for sacrifice. So in my twisted, weird rationalization, it made perfect sense for why God would willingly let this happen. But it wasn't the same explanation as your typical Christian because of that cognitive dissonance. And I really wanted to get the, "Okay, I don't believe in the Trinity, but I wanna believe in Christianity. How do I reconcile this?" And that was my nonsensical reconciliation, if you will. So when I moved into Islam, it was more I felt I got to get to know God on a more personal level, quote, unquote. Now, granted, I don't believe in God now, but at the time, um, I got to know him more personally and understand who he actually was versus who Christianity was telling me he was.
Do you
Would
think
you
if
do-
you'd have,
oh, sorry, go on.
sorry, Richard, do you think if you'd have come across a sect of Christianity that didn't hold Jesus as God, do you think that would have swayed you to remain Christian?
Oh, probably. I had no desire to leave Christianity when I stumbled across Islam. Like, it was a surprise to me. Um, and the other thing was, like, completely different religions. If I had talked to a Buddhist and they had convinced me of some sort of spirituality, like, Richard, I know that you've studied a lot with Buddhism and stuff. I probably would have, at that point, let go of the God character, but bought into all that spiritual woo and all the stuff that goes along with it. So I really did have that strong desire to hold on to spirituality. So I think I was just ripe for, the first convincing argument that came along, you know?
It's funny you should say that because it was actually the woo, the spiritual woo that which kept me kind of arm's length from Buddhism because I've studied the scriptures for a long time and meditation. And I love meditation. I spoke about it briefly the other night when we were
Yeah.
on Oz's show, and but it was a kind of I couldn't get past the reincarnation and the divas and the god characters and the realms of existence. I just couldn't push myself into that kind. And I think if I had a done, I might have dived headfirst into it. Uh,
Absolutely.
Certainly, I had a friend who I started a meditation group with, uh, and he became a monk. He went on to become a monk.
Oh, wow.
So
It's a shame, really, because you had the hairstyle already sorted.
I know,
I know,
right?
definitely.
Yeah, I
But
think go ahead.
go on, Laura.
No, I was just
After
gonna
you.
piggyback on what you say that I think, what brings us into or out of religion really is our ability to process whether or not we believe in, like, the spiritual aspect of it. So in that respect, it's almost less about God and whether or not a God exists and more about the unknown and what we're willing to accept as individuals about the unknown. And then God is just this character that comes into it and just plays a part.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the point you make there about like having to accept the spiritual aspects of stuff is really interesting because in lots of ways I could even, see myself going back to the church I went to because I love the people and I love the sound
Mm.
of the words of the services and like the community and the music and all of those sorts of aspects to it. Actually, probably just because I was raised in that sort of environment, it still comforts me. I was I won't go into details of it, but I was recently in a conversation online with a lot of people, and a prayer was said as part of the thing, and even the prayer that was said as part of this meeting with lots of people still really sort of calmed me down or whatever else because I'm used to that. I don't know if it's just programming, social programming or whatever, but yeah, I remember when I must have been about 8 or 9 years old, and this is linking back to something you said ages ago, Laura. Um, One of the questions that I asked my vicar at the time at church was, if God can do anything, how come, and this is sort of slightly off topic, but that's how we go. If God can do anything, how come Jesus had to die in order to, you know, save us from our sins and whatever else? And
Right.
his answer was basically like, well, the Jews at the time sacrificed things to God to ask for forgiveness, so it was like a bit of a metaphor for that. He didn't use the word metaphor, but his explanation was that it was like a metaphor for the sacrifices the Jews had, so they'd understand what Jesus was about and why he was there and stuff. And I think in lots of ways, you don't often have opportunities to think like that when you go to religious services week on week, or when you go, surrounded by religious people, because it's sort of not the way that you're trained to think about things and consider things, those sorts of big ideas. It's easy to talk about an all-powerful God without really thinking about what that means and what that entails in
Yeah,
a
yeah,
big
not
picture.
following it to its logical conclusion.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't
It's
mean to cut you off and stop you altogether.
No, no, no.
Did you
I'd
wanna
sort of finished. I was glad for the intro.
I was just going to say regarding the your feeling comfort in church and things, that I've visited a lot of churches and temples and mosques and things, and I think the kind of my mind's eye church of the one we got married in, me and my wife, we it's a small congregation, really quiet, traditional spire church, and I loved it there. I love that the silence and the I enjoyed attending the services there just for the silence and
Wow.
things. I mean, the singing bit got because they were kind of the traditional oh,
I like the
kind of
chanting.
hymns, and all like that. Not really me, but but the quiet bits, I've really enjoyed going. And then I've been to the kind of happy clappy big warehouse churches, and I can't stand them. I can't be doing with all this hand raising and praise the Lord, that kind of thing. But this, I think for anyone, even if you've not had any kind of Christian upbringing, there's nothing wrong with going to churches and enjoying the architecture and that sort of thing.
Because they're
And
built
the
and made in
community.
special places, whether or not you agree with the reason why people
Yeah.
built them to be special, it's yeah. Because I often think about the concept of gods, and I don't know if this is pithy, so please tell me if I'm being pithy. But I, I
I'll
often
unpith
think
it for you later.
absolutely. Um, I I often think about, like, looking back in time in history, and we've talked about, the Greek gods and the Roman gods and the Norse gods and all this lot. And I can understand why then, when they didn't understand about electrons bashing together in clouds, creating electrical charge and forming lightning, that would be this unbelievable thing to happen, and there'd be no way of them understanding scientifically what's going on there. And this story and the poem, especially in societies which were, storytelling societies, their culture was built around oral traditions and stuff. Why it would make sense to have these stories about the gods being angry in the sky or whatever it was. And I think it's now, as an atheist and a skeptic, I can see the Christian God that I used to believe in almost in exactly the same way, like in exactly the same category. Not necessarily
Mhm.
saying that it's just the lightning and the wind and whatever else, but in a yeah, slightly more built up, broader sense. Uh,
Grandiose, yeah.
yeah, yeah, the same category, and I never could see that when I was a Christian. It was always like, because obviously we've got it right here in Christianity, and we learn about these other gods, lowercase g, in lots of other ways. But I think it's just crazy difficult to analyze your own viewpoint when you're in that environment.
Yeah. How about you, Laura? Did you have kind of a God of the gaps conception of your God now you've left religion? Do you view that in the same way as that it is just an ever shrinking uh God of the gaps, really?
You mean, like, how do I perceive the concept of the Christian God now
Yeah,
as
yeah,
the God of
yeah.
the gaps? Yeah, absolutely. I think that, there is sort of this, I would say, competition between what they call, like, religion and science. I don't think that the 2 are mutually exclusive, but because of how God has this explanatory power for where we come from and who we are and what makes us us, the more that science challenges that and the more that science answers those questions with hard evidence, the less really wiggle room there is for a God. So I think that, the Christian God, even in just the last 50 years, has evolved so much to fit into our current concepts of reality that as our scientific concepts advance, our concepts of God evolve and change, and the character changes. And I think that's really interesting. And I think that more than anything else, and being an anthropologist, going back to the very beginning and seeing how it evolves from the earliest civilizations till today, the fact that the God character so perfectly adapts to whatever our current cultural understanding is to me blatant proof that whatever this God character is, even if there is a deity out there somewhere, this God character isn't it.
So I
Yeah.
think that, sorry, I think it's interesting the difference as well, obviously with a transatlantic panel that we've got ourselves set up here, because I see in America, because of that issue of, you know, the science sort of taking away this and taking away that from the Christian God, that you do have lots of Christians in America. It's not just America, obviously, but lots of Christians in America just say, because of that, all of this science is wrong, regardless of what it
Right.
tells us, what the evidence is, all of that sort of stuff. All of this science is wrong because God is right. Whereas I think me and Richard are lucky that we live in a country where, for the most part, Christianity completely has adapted to our scientific understanding. You know, most Christians in the Church of England and the Catholic Church and most Protestant churches and what have you, you know, accept most of Big Bang cosmology and evolution and all the sorts of things. And it's interesting the difference between those conceptions we've got. You know, the Church of England obviously has issues and there's internal politics and stuff, but you know, most Anglicans in the UK are at least moderately pro LGBT issues and stuff. You know, we can have gay clergy members, and just as one example. Whereas, you know, you look in the Bible and can see very clearly that that's not the tale the Bible
Oh,
tells of that
sure.
issue. And like you say, it's through history, God has adapted. God
Mhm.
has adapted to fit the moral standing of the day, because people want to keep this God idea, but also have their own ideas about what is moral and immoral. And it's that sort of reconciliation of those two ideas that everybody has in their own minds. And I was exactly the same when I was a Christian. But it's just different in different places at different times.
Can I just be nitpicky on a couple of points?
Yeah.
One from you
That's
and
the whole
one that
purpose
Laura
of this.
raised as well.
Oh, bring it on.
First of all, I think I agree with you that overall that's the case in Britain, but I do
Yeah.
also think I know lots of evangelicals who
Hmm.
don't accept evolution and things.
Oh,
But I
certainly.
think-
Oh, yeah. I didn't
I
want
think-
to. If I expressed that as a sort of blanket statement for everyone, I certainly, didn't mean to. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's probably. I mean, I've been doing this a long time. I've been doing this kind of stuff for 25 years. So I think that's probably because I'm a little bit more well-traveled than your average kind of commentator
Mr. Richard.
on this thing. So I do know lots of people who are like that in Britain. But also, just nipping back to something Laura said as well,
Mhm.
when she was saying that science challenged the God question. I don't think it quite challenges it, and I think that is a misconception that a lot of Christians have, and that's why they see it as a kind of one or the other thing. Because
Like a battle.
yeah, but I think science definitely makes God shrink the gaps that God could go, but I don't think it does it purposefully. I think it's not going out there to disprove God. It's just doing what it does, and as a consequence, the gaps that God can fit into shrinks. And I think that it's the same kind of thing as that skepticism is often accused of from theists, that they say it goes out to try and debunk things, and it doesn't. Skepticism
Like
is
it's
not
trying
about
to disprove God.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not trying to debunk things. It's just looking to see if there is evidence for the claim, and that's it.
No, I
No,
think
no,
you're spot on there. And just to clarify, when I say that like science is challenging the God character, I don't mean science is challenging whether or not there is a God. And I don't
yeah,
mean that it's doing it deliberately either. I just mean that we have these things written out in the Bible that like, hey, this is the way it is, that go against nature and what we observe and what we know.
yeah.
And so I think that the more we learn, like you said, the more it's naturally challenged. But also I don't think that science even touches on whether or not there is a God. And I don't even know that there's a way to right now that that we know of to even
Well, I
test
think, so
it.
I've had conversations with various family members as well about this specific thing of, well, if God is supernatural, the only way we could these words weren't used, but if God is supernatural, we only have natural ways of investigating things.
Mhm.
So how would we be able to, investigate God? How would we be able to prove it? Of course we can't. So therefore God exists. It's like that sort of argument.
Oh,
The
I don't
thing
know,
is,
therefore God. Yeah.
Yeah.
which is a fair enough argument, and there very conceivably could be a supernatural God out there that we don't know of. The
Sure.
problem is that theists don't accept that God, or not all. Most theists don't accept that God, because what most theists do, they have a concept of a God who interacts with the world,
Mhm.
and if
And
God
they like they're
interacts with the
testing it.
world, that interaction should be able to be tested.
Yeah.
And when it has been tested, with, for example, prayer, when they've actually done studies uh, to see if prayer works, it's come out at no better than chance.
Right.
So when
Ooh,
when
no, I was just gonna say in
oh,
some cases it's come out worse than chance, because in some
yeah,
cases the studies show that when a person knows that they're being prayed for,
yeah,
they actually did worse.
yeah,
Because it's
that
all in
was
hand. It's all in
it
hand being
was
taken care of.
the same
Exactly.
study, I think, by the Templeton Foundation, I think it was, who carried it out, that found that it worked worse than chance when people knew about it, and
Yep.
at chance when they didn't.
Odd
But
how that happens.
a lot of people don't like a lot of skeptics or atheists don't like the Templeton Foundation because it's a Christian organization. But to my mind, I don't agree with what they're trying to do, because they're trying to prove God. But at least they're honest about the way they conduct the research overall.
Mhm. And
They're
they're
showing
putting
And
the
that.
results out there, whether they're good or bad for their
yeah,
cause.
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And
it's admirable, isn't it? If you're in that position to say, well, yeah, I believe this stuff, but let's actually try and get to a point where we
yeah,
can say this is the proof. Yeah, it's admirable.
yeah, definitely. And I think that's I mean, I don't know much about this area. So either one of you may correct me on this, but I think a lot of the early archaeological work that was carried out in the Middle East and things was which contributed largely to the idea that there wasn't archaeological evidence for God. The I think a lot of those things, when they went out there doing that, they were trying to prove God. They were trying to find the evidence for God, and they
Mhm.
just couldn't find it. It wasn't there. They were trying to find the evidence of the Exodus and of things like this, and they couldn't find that evidence.
So it's my understanding as well that, like, because they went there for that purpose, and again, I'm not an expert in this area, so uh, I may be wrong in various things, but because they went there for that purpose, like certain bits of evidence that proved contrary to their mission and their stated goal was destroyed in the process as well. Like, it was purposely like covering their tracks, as in, like, yeah, this actually shows that this wasn't indeed true, and so let's get rid of it. Um, yeah.
That's really interesting, and that talks a lot about, like, the cultural narratives that we build where we present whatever evidence, and this goes outside of God, maybe this is a little bit off track, but, it really goes to speak to how we are so caught up in our own personal narratives that we pick and choose what information is and isn't viable information, and as a result, I think a lot of people who have these really hardcore ideas, and not just Christians, Muslims,
Yeah,
Hindus, Buddhists, everybody, they'll pick and choose that little bit of information that supports
definitely.
their claims, and then the rest of the information just gets put off to the side.
And uh, again, Laura might have a better insight into this, having come from that kind of background. But it's from the interaction I've had with Muslims, they tend to have a different approach to it, whereas Christians tend to, on the most part, battle science, especially in the States where you're from, and where
Mhm.
I personally am familiar with kind of having interlocutors from the States who are Christian,
Right.
more than pretty much in Britain recently. Um, that they tend to have this battle against science, whereas I think Islam, as a more the approach there is more to say that science actually backs up what we're saying.
Mhm.
And I don't know if that's your opinion or what you found when you were a
Just
Muslim as
in
well,
addition
but
as well, I think historically Islam has been a very scientific,
oh,
mathematical,
definitely.
intellectually powerful culture, and I think that possibly plays then into the narrative nowadays. But I'll let Laura actually answer the question again. I apologize.
No, no, no. I mean, like, I am not, like, all that is like I'm not the only expert on. I'm not even an expert on Islam, let alone the only one. So you guys can interject whenever you want. But um, so Islam deliberately teaches the seeking of knowledge. So a lot of the verses are vague enough that it doesn't make scientific claims that are so clear that it can be tested. I mean, there's
That was
some when
very
you start.
clever of Allah. Very
Very
clever of
clever.
them
He's a
when he
very
wrote the
smart
book.
gentleman, that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, there are some that can be tested. You talk about things like supernatural stuff like the moon being broken in half or shattered and then God putting it back together. Or the ride that Muhammad took to Jerusalem. Right. So there are some very non-scientific, very supernatural claims. And there's claims about the mountains being pegs and the holding the earth still and stuff like that. It's not true.
Yeah.
So there are some non-scientific stuff in the Quran. However, the teachings are that you should seek knowledge and that you should challenge your beliefs, and that the more you seek knowledge and the more you challenge your beliefs, the more that Allah will reinforce those beliefs and make your faith stronger. And so the teaching now, this isn't every Muslim's teaching. There are cultures that have gone so bass backwards that they disregard all of this stuff, like the compulsion of the hijab and stuff like that. So they've got it all fast backwards. But speaking of the actual core teachings in the Quran, the the whole focus is on seeking knowledge and being wise and testing and like there's very clear verses that say and I can't remember what the actual verse is. I wish I could like off the top of my head, but it talks about how foolish the person is who doesn't seek knowledge, and they really really embraced that during their golden age. And it was just one leader whose name I can't remember right now who was able to just crumble that, along with other social, political, and spiritual dynamics that were happening at the time that just crushed that Islamic golden age and that seeking for knowledge. But it's still there, you know.
And to be fair as well to Islam, the and again to show that sometimes religions can do good things, even if it's for the wrong reasons. Is that instruction to go out and seek knowledge did lead to some fantastic scientific breakthroughs.
Algebra,
Yeah, exactly. And
And
that's
I'm
what
number
actually a
zero.
massive fan.
Yeah, and it did, and that's an example of when religion can. I mean, we have modern examples of like charity work and things carried out by religions,
Sure.
but and community where people might not find that elsewhere. But that's an example of when religion does something right, even if it's for the wrong reasons.
It's like that thing about like architecture and art and things and music,
Yeah.
in the past where people have been sponsored by a church or a clergy person, or, people have been inspired because of religious stories and tales that have created these amazing pieces of architecture and artwork and sculpture and whatever else. But yeah, it certainly doesn't make them any less amazing and awe-inspiring
Not
because
at
of
all.
their origin and what have you. And going back to something you said, Laura, about the certain things that are unscientific in the Quran,
Mhm.
about like the mountains being pegs or whatever. I think it's really easy to then, like we said about like God adapting, holy books as well adapting to the narrative of the day and our scientific understanding, because like, you know, the story of this that doesn't combat science was literally true, and the one that does go against what we understand scientifically was actually just
It's a metaphor.
a parable, or it was a metaphor for what was going on. It was because Jesus taught in parables, so obviously there are stories in the Bible which were also taught in the same way because Jesus is God and that's how God tells stories. And it's
Yeah.
it's really easy to fit those things into our own way of thinking about things and understanding.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think it's a good point and maybe a good opportunity to maybe take a step back since we're talking about how God adapts. Ooh, my camera's getting all blurry and not blurry. How God adapts to the culture and stuff is to maybe have us talk a little bit about the God concept in general, like how it evolved, how it affects us today, what can we know about it as skeptics, what do we and don't we accept about the God concept.
Are you suggesting, Laura, that we actually
Stay on
undertake the
topic.
mission of this episode?
Hey, there's a reason you chose me to run this. I'm steering the ship. We're getting back on course. Drop the coconuts. We're sailing. Okay, so I don't want to take over too much in terms of like the whole anthropological historical thing, which is kind of my passion. I'm curious from each of you guys what your overall concepts of um, not God, but God as a concept. What are your guys' understanding of that? Where did it come from? What is the importance of it? Why do we still have a God at this day and age?
Do you want to go first, Richard?
Um, I can do, but I may be cheating a little bit because I'm actually doing a degree in religion, philosophy, and ethics.
That's not cheating. That's called using your resources.
Yeah. But independent of that, I think I've always kind of had the idea that people came up with these concepts, and you can tell by looking at the artwork of kind of, don't want to say proto-humans, but certainly early humans before civilization, about 50,000 years ago. In
So
the
hominids.
artwork, yeah, and the artworks and that they were creating carvings from deer antlers and things. The anthropomorphized.
Trying to get my camera to focus.
I'll
We can get
Anthropomorphizing.
subtitles, can't we? For
I'll
whatever.
yeah. I'll let one of the people who've already actually got a degree pronounce it for me. But they were viewing the world through that, and I think it's only a natural step to go from that, from creating artworks and things like that, and trying to understand the world around you through that, to creating a wider concept and seeing the reason behind that, and seeing that interaction as having a purpose. And certainly in Britain, in some of the Stone Age settlements that are still around, we can see primitive drawings that scientists think align to the understanding they had of the world at the time. I thought we were going on a little tour then.
I am messing with the camera while you're talking. Just keep talking like I'm not messing with the camera.
So yeah, that's kind of my understanding, which may be completely wrong, but it's kind of the view I've always had, not being kind of indoctrinated into a religion, as to why religions formed. It was just a natural process of people trying to formulate an understanding of the world around them.
I think something you said as well about purpose is key to a lot of it. I think because we all have a self-aggrandized view of what we are in the universe, when actually we're these teeny tiny little specks of nothing. And I think we all have, again, wide blanket statement, but all have this sort of desire to have a purpose and have this higher purpose. You know, I'm meant for more than this, or as part of a bigger picture, a jigsaw piece in this grand. I'm mixing my metaphors now, but and I think, you know, having an external outsourced body which gives you that purpose, I think, is quite an easy thing to fall into. And certainly then when you build up organized religions that have a very set idea of what a god is, that have this clear purpose mixed in with societal pressures, peer pressure, family pressures, traditions and culture, when it's all intermingled and intertwined, especially with like theocracies and, you know, political and physical power comes into it. I think it's, you know, in a lot of ways, up until modern times, you know, inescapable, especially, like I say, when it's along with that idea of purpose and drive.
Yeah, wasn't Leviticus pretty much a list of rules
Thou
that were
shalt
formulated to
not.
control
Yes.
people?
Well, and they were also they were rules formulated to control people, but they were also a reflection of that culture at that time, like what was acceptable and unacceptable in that culture at that time. So from our perspective, it's completely brutal, but at the time, God's like, yeah, do it this way. Right? If you're going to beat your slave, just make sure he doesn't die.
Yeah. Please go into this village and kill everybody, including the male children, but just take the virgin girls for your own. That's absolutely fine.
Don't worry, I'll sort it all out later. I got this. Just kill them all.
As long as you don't eat any shellfish while you're there, we are okay.
Right. Don't mix your fabrics.
So from Laura, from the professional standpoint, what's your opinion on it?
Well, so I think you really hit the nail on the head in terms of the explanatory power of God. And I think that other Richard, you also hit the nail on the head with the needing a purpose, needing a bigger explanation. So I don't see religion or God as a single thing or body. It's sort of an emergent sort of phenomenon that came out of culture, and it's sort of like when you talk about Marxism, and if you look at it purely in terms of economics, you're missing the point because there's the socio political, economic, cultural, um, all these other facets to consider in terms of that particular philosophy. So now you talk about religion, and you have where do we come from? Where are we going? What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to behave? What is our purpose here? And you have these blends of all these different questions. And some religions answer some of them. Some religions might answer more, but there's no one size fits all in terms of religion. So I think the earliest religions, the way that they evolved, were explanatory. It started out with things like spirits. It was very like animistic, and then it went into shamanistic, where it's like, well, not only there's these spirits, but now we have this guy over here that when he gets high on mushrooms, he can commune with them. And then so you get these increasingly complex religious systems that
There are still people like that around who think that they can
absolutely,
communicate with spirits when
yeah,
they're
and
on mushrooms.
there's still animistic religions out there. So you look at some of these tribes that haven't been introduced to this sort of monotheistic idea, and they have these very small groups of people. They don't have these big civilizations to rule, which is a whole other topic. But they still adhere to the very more personal nature spirit, or what do they call it? The ancestor worship, where okay, our ancestors go into the ground and then their spirits are around somewhere. They don't have this concept of this father god or this overarching authority that tells us how we're supposed to live our lives. So you can still see those like proto religions today, and we can kind of study them today, and then extrapolate back to the time to hey, maybe this is a lot how some of these other religions were, and kind of fill in the gaps where we don't have knowledge, um, which obviously is speculative, but um, where you start to see more authoritarian gods is where you start to see bigger societies. And it's
Yeah.
interesting that that god character emerged at roughly the same time that our cultures started forming these bigger and more complex societies. And now all of a
It's
sudden,
interesting you say that, because I was going to say that in Britain, the Neolithic period, when the smaller kind of wandering herdsmen started forming small towns and uh, having to protect areas,
mhm,
and the religion first kind of took on an organized form was at exactly the same time that warfare became a thing between rival towns, because until that time they didn't need to fight because they were just
right.
wandering herdsmen. It wasn't until they had territories and they had resources that they needed to protect
Mhm.
that people started fighting amongst themselves, and that is when religions first started to be. I'm not correlating the two, but
No,
they
I think
seem
there's some rough
to
correlations you can make.
Mm.
they seem to arise at the same time for the same reasons.
Yeah, and going back to that brings up a really good point that the first early gods that you would call authoritarian gods. I mean, obviously we have like the pantheon gods, right? Like the Greek gods and the Roman and the Egyptian, where there's just tons and tons and tons of gods, the Hindu gods.
And the early Hebrew
Putting
gods.
yeah, yeah. So putting all that, well, okay, so that's what I was about to get to, right? So in the very, very beginning, even with the Hebrews, the gods were tribal gods. So when someone would say that my god's the best or my god is the leader or whatever, um, it was kind of like my football team is the best football team, or my nation is the best, most successful nation.
My dad's
Um,
bigger than your dad.
yeah, yeah, my dad can kick your dad's ass.
Yeah.
And so yeah, the early Jewish god was like a war god, and he fit all of the descriptions of like your typical war god, and
Because we see that as well in the Ten Commandments, don't we? You know, there is no God before God, like the one true, as in like, you know, it's part of that. You know, there are all these other gods, obviously, but I'm
school
the
of
God.
me.
I'm like the man.
Oh,
Yeah,
they were widely accepted in those early the time when the Bible was first written. The first couple of 100 years of the Bible, there was no doubt that there was more than one God. That wasn't the question.
oh,
The
absolutely.
question was who is the daddy? You
Yeah,
know?
well, and so now you have this concept of this monotheistic religion, and now we have to re-explain the past and make it fit our narrative, and we
Yeah.
forget that. I mean, let's pretend, for example, that there is only one God and that it is the God of the Bible, and that the Christians or Muslims or Jews, just pick one, have it exactly right. You still can't deny that going back into that period of time, those people viewed that God differently, right?
Mm.
So we've reinvented our past to fit this narrative that we have of this sky daddy. And I know that that's a bit of a straw man and oversimplifying, but this father figure, an authoritarian God, when really he was just the patron god of this tribe of Israel. And so, yeah, he was authoritarian over them, but they never had this conception at that time that that God should be followed by all these other people.
Did you know that as a Christian, by the way, Laura, that information about the early Hebrews and their
No,
idea about God and gods? And no, no, no,
no,
no, no one ever
so
does.
it was finding one question after another as I was reading the Bible and as I was going to church. I would just start looking into little things here and there. The first one was whether or not the Bible was the inspired word of God. Because I had read the Bible before I became a Christian. I was like, I already know that can't possibly be true. Right. So yeah, no, I that was something I stumbled across. I think I was Muslim at the time that I stumbled across that actually.
How about you, Richard?
No, no, certainly not. And I think that's telling, isn't it? Like it's indicative of that sort of lack of wanting to explore any sort of flaws or alternatives, or even the fact that I didn't really consider when I was a Christian, who wrote the Bible, or the question of biblical authority and the truth of the Bible and the stories in there. Because when you trust people who are in charge and are teaching you things, like they're telling you the stuff's right, and my eyes have been well and truly open to all those sorts of things. Since becoming a skeptic and investigating more, and I think it's just fascinating. And you can see it all makes sense. Moving from that sort of earlier idea of all those other gods to where we are now with religions across the world. It makes sense, and it is really, really fascinating from all those sorts of different, societal and cultural ideas. It just then saddens me when there are people still all over the world who dedicate their lives to these gods and these religious ideas, when obviously to my mind and both of your minds, that they're just wrong about those ideas. And having religious ideas and a belief in God can lead to some brilliant and wonderful things, like you were talking about, Richard. But I just wonder what the world would be like if actually we finally got to the point where people realized or understood the truth of the world and understood these ideas about gods in a sort of, it would be impossible, I guess, but like an unjaded, sort of unbiased light. And what would societies be like moving forward? What would the world
Star
be like?
Trek.
Star Trek.
So do you want to talk on this first, Richard? Because I have something I want to say, but I want to give you the opportunity to talk. So I'm gonna let you take it first, and then I want to.
No, no, no. I'd sort of come to an end, so no, go for it.
Okay. Well, I mean, and other Richard, did you want to?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
That could get confusing.
I know. I should call you like Richard 1 or Richard 2 or.
No, I think one thing I do want to come back to, if you remind me in a bit before we finish,
Mhm.
is because I can just hear the theists screaming at us while they're watching this, saying, but you haven't talked about the philosophical argument for God, and they're the important things. But
Right.
but to me, those arguments have developed as well over time.
Mhm.
They didn't start. If you look at the actual scriptures from the time, there were no complex philosophical arguments for gods. They were later thinkers who were trying to explain these religious ideas to themselves and their audience. And
is it
As opposed.
oversimplified to ask the question, like, if we need philosophical arguments for the existence of God, surely that even in and of itself is a piece of evidence to disprove the existence of gods. Like,
Or at least
I
disprove
think
a specific claim.
but I mean, like, sorry, go on.
Having looked at a lot of, if not most of, the philosophical arguments for God, I don't think we need worry about them anyway, because they're not very good, really. I fail to see how someone can be convinced, and I'm going to use this particular example because I'm in a long email exchange with someone at the minute
Bad
using
luck.
this particular example, the Kalam cosmological argument.
Mhm.
And I fail to see how that can convince anyone. I find it mind-boggling.
It doesn't lead anywhere either, does it? Like, it doesn't
No,
get
it's
anywhere.
no,
Okay, so
no.
that is where I gotta cut in really quick because that is something that I think as humans that we need to like if we're gonna be skeptical, it's something that we need to understand about ourselves and about each other. Is that like we can look at an argument and say, wow, that's a really bad argument. Like that shouldn't even be an argument, or we don't need to waste our time on that. But as long as there are still people who accept that argument as a good one, we need to worry about it and we need to talk
Yeah,
about it. I don't think we
yeah.
need to know like how to elegantly and academically address every single bad philosophical argument. But I think it's good to at least throw them out there and talk about them.
It's been my
Um,
life for 25 years talking
yeah.
about it. So
And nobody it's still around, and
yeah,
Richard, that is an old the Kalam cosmological argument has been around.
yeah.
So and it's not going anywhere anytime soon because the vast majority of people on this planet are not philosophizers, and the vast majority aren't
No,
even, like, academically minded, and I'm not calling anyone stupid or unintelligent. I'm saying there's methods by which you examine, arguments, and
yeah,
they can be very complex, and the average person is gonna hear an argument, and it's gonna either feel or sound right or feel or sound wrong, and if it sounds wrong, they're just gonna dismiss it, and if it sounds right, it's gonna take a little bit more for them to dismiss it, like either counter evidence or a better argument. They're more likely to just take it in, and
I think the
especially
clown cosmological argument is one of those, though, that can sound really it sounds
it
sensible
sounds
on the surface.
elegant. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a mess, but it sounds really good. So, um, Gilliver, I'll start calling you guys by your last name. Do you wanna quickly go over what some of those philosophical arguments are? And then we can just kind of briefly discuss maybe why we don't give them much credence?
uh,
Or is that for another we should probably save that for another podcast, huh?
yeah.
I mean, that side was definitely a no.
I think it's yeah, I think it's sufficient for now because I'm really enjoying the way the conversation is going. I don't want to bog it down in all that philosophical thing. I think it's sufficient to mention it, and that was what I wanted to do. Just because I could see people screaming at the TVs or the phones or whatever they're watching this on, and kind of saying, yeah, but you've not mentioned that, and I just wanted to bring it to the fore that we are aware of those things.
Okay,
But to me,
so oh, go ahead.
I was just going to finish by saying that to me, the kind of the conversation we're having is far more interesting than those philosophical arguments.
Oh,
Burn.
that is entirely subjective. Okay, so for everybody listening, we are not gonna hit on every single subject about God in the first episode, but we do have a long list of episodes, and while not all of them are about God, there are gonna be quite a few that touch on the subject over and over again, so there's gonna be a lot of overlap. And philosophy and some of the philosophical arguments will be, episodes that we specifically focus on, because that's gonna take some time to unpack and to talk about.
I think it's probably noteworthy as well to sort of put on the table that we are a group of skeptics
Mhm.
with no representation from the other side,
Yep.
but we've all in various sorts of means and guises been on the other side, and we sort of bring those hats with us, I guess, when we're having these conversations.
Yeah, and not every single, discussion has to have representation from every single
Oh
perspective.
no, agreed.
Although I think that it'd be kinda cool occasionally to have somebody on that, kinda challenge our views or have, like, an opposing view. But, no, this is kind of our opportunity to say, as skeptics, this is our stance, this is what we believe, this is what we think, kind of unchallenged, like it or not. But it's also our chance to see where we disagree or where, we can come up with questions for each other because not all just like every Christian is different, every atheist is different, every skeptic is different. So, I think that we I mean, just from this discussion, we all 3 have very different backgrounds, in regards to God. So, yeah.
Yeah, and also I think it's very important that for me anyway, I don't know whether you two agree with me, and feel free to disagree, but I think these discussions aren't about trying to reach any kind of conclusion.
Mm-mm.
We're not
I've
trying to
certainly
say
reached none. Like zero conclusions were made here.
Yeah, we're not trying to go out and put forward the opinion that God definitely doesn't exist. That's the end of it. We're just talking about the idea. That's all we're doing. We're just having a conversation, and we welcome disagreement and we welcome comments from people who
Absolutely.
may have opposing views.
And we're not making arguments. Like, I'm not sitting here saying this is why there's no God or anything like that. We're just shooting the shit. And
Yeah.
so it'd be interesting to see how people react to that. Like, oh, well, you said this. Did you really mean that? Or, make it into this really, is it going to become this really broad, more academic discussion? Or is it just going to be like a casual conversation?
Awesome.
All right. So are we ready to wrap this one up? We are at about like a little bit less than an hour. So,
Yeah.
all right. So today we talked about God. Is there anything else that you guys want to talk about to kind of close it up? Any closing thoughts?
I'm good.
Yeah, me too. I think we've had a good conversation, and I think we've certainly got a good leap pad to jump on if we have any further conversation on the same subject.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So if you're listening to this right now and this spurred any questions or anything that you want to hear more about, if it spurred any topic ideas, let us know and we'll add it to our list, or we can engage with it and have some fun with it. So we are Laura,
Richard,
and Richard, and this is the Skeptic Hangout. Until next time.
Keep questioning.
interrogate your beliefs.
And stay skeptical.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.